Hello everyone, and welcome to my CBS Full Today channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Nick Newman no way imagined his life would constrict to a single moment where instinct, rage, and fear collided so violently that the line between protection and bloodsucker dissolved. Yet that was exactly where he stood as the verity about Matt eventually exploded, turning every immolation Nick had made into commodity grotesque and cruel. Because Matt was no way just a shadowy trouble lurking on the edges of Genoa City but a calculated driver who had manipulated commitment, traded secrets, and weaponized the people Nick loved most. And formally Nick understood that Matt had finagled the chain of events that risked his family, destabilized Newman Enterprises, and nearly destroyed Noah's faith in him. Commodity and Nick snapped with intimidating clarity, not the reckless wrathfulness of his youth but a cold wave, controlled resoluteness born from times of loss and treason, and that resoluteness followed him into a battle that would echo through Genoa City 4 times, as Matt, trim in his belief that Nick would no way cross that final line, undervalued the depth of a Newman push too far. Because Nick didn't arrive crying or hanging, he arrived silent, eyes stoned by the consummation that every moral concession he'd avoided in the history had only inspired men like Matt. And in that silence lay the most dangerous interpretation of Nick Newman yet, one forged by the ghosts of his history and the implied pledge that no bone would ever jeopardize his family again, not while he still had breath in his body. And when the battle escalated, it wasn't dramatic in the way Genoa City anticipated. It was intimate and nipping, a struggle fueled by exposures Matt no way intended Nick to uncover, secrets involving coastal accounts, blackmail influence tied to long-buried dishonest, and a crooked contingency plan that intertwined important numbers who believed themselves untouchable. And as Matt fought back, desperately adhering to his vision of control, Nick saw commodity that frightened him indeed more than Matt's crimes, the certainty that Matt believed he'd walk down from this like he always did, leaving desolation behind him while others paid the price. And in that instant Nick made a choice that would hang him long after the moment passed, because when Matt's life hung in the balance, when one final movement could end it all, Nick didn't pull down incontinently, he dithered just long enough for the weight of his decision to crush down on him, and that vacillation was everything, because it revealed the verity Nick would latterly struggle to face, that for a bit of an alternate, he'd wanted it to be over, wanted the trouble gone ever, wanted peace at any cost. And although Matt survived, slightly adhering to life as enchantresses sliced through the night and the consequences of that moment gurgled outward, the damage was formally done, because tried murder leaves scars deeper than any conviction, and Genoa City would soon smell that commodity abecedarian had shifted, as whispers spread about Nick's involvement, about the brutality of the hassle, about the look in his eyes subsequently that no one could relatively explain. And while Victoria questioned the recklessness of his conduct and Victor still calculated how to contain the fallout without exposing the Newman conglomerate to ruin, Nick set up himself twisting inward, scuffling with the knowledge that he'd crossed a line he formerly swore he no way would. Indeed, as new exposures surfaced that made it clear Matt's survival might be more dangerous than his death, because from his sanitarium bed Matt came a ticking time lemon, holding evidence that could strike reports, shatter alliances, and expose crimes long buried beneath layers of power and honor. And as investigators closed in and adversaries maneuvered to silence Matt permanently, Nick realized the agony was far from over, that his conduct had only accelerated a deadly wind-up in which fidelity would be tested, verity would come at armament, and the cost of guarding family might demand offerings Nick was no longer sure he could survive, especially as those closest to him began to see him else, not just as the moral center of the Newman family but as a man able of intimidating violence when pushed. And in that shift lay the most ruinous consequence of all, because Genoa City thrives on reproach. But it remembers moments of weakness, and Nick Newman's moment, caught between justice and revenge, love and destruction, would review him in ways no reason or explanation could ever undo, leaving one question hanging over every rumored discussion and every calculating regard: if Nick Newman could nearly kill formally, what would stop him from doing it again when the coming deadly secret came to light? In the days that followed Matt's narrow survival, Genoa City was under a suffocating pressure that felt nearly physical, as though the air itself knew commodity inenarrable had happed and was staying for the verity to face. And Nick Newman moved through it like a man walking through fog, apprehensive of the gapes, the hushed exchanges that stopped when he entered a room, the subtle shift in how people regarded him, Because word traveled presto indeed when data did not, and the story that spread was more dangerous than the verity, painting Nick as a man who had eventually lost control, a Newman who had embraced the darker instincts Victor had always advised him about, and while Nick tried to move himself that he'd done what was necessary, that Matt's conduct justified everything that had passed, the mistrustfulness eroded at him relentlessly, especially as fractions of memory replayed in his mind, the weight of that moment when he could have walked down sooner, the consummation that restraint had come latterly than it should have, and as investigators began circling, making together timelines and motives with cold perfection, Nick set up himself facing a reality he could ent blackjack or outthink, because this was ent a hostile preemption or a family feud. This was an implicit felonious reckoning that hovered to expose not only his conduct but the fragile moral foundation he'd erected his life upon, and while Victor still pulled strings behind the scenes, using influence to delay processes and muddy jurisdictional waters, Nick felt an unanticipated resistance rising within him, a turn down to hide behind the Newman name, because commodity had shifted in him after that night, commodity raw and unsettled that demanded responsibility indeed as it scarified him, and that internal conflict only strengthened when new exposures surfaced from Matt's history, exposures that suggested his crimes extended far beyond what Nick had uncovered, entwining numbers across Genoa City's nobility, weaving a web of corruption so intricate that Matt's survival came both a liability and a log-rolling chip, and as power players maneuvered to control the narrative, Nick realized with grim clarity that his attempt to stop one man might have destabilized an entire system, and that consummation visited him most when he looked at his children, when he saw the implied questions in Noah's eyes and the quiet fear in Faith's, because no matter how he justified his conduct, he couldn't deny that he'd brought darkness closer to them than ever ahead, and as days turned into weeks, Matt's condition changed, each update from the sanitarium reigniting fear and computation in equal measure, because a conscious Matt meant exposure, evidence, and vengeance, while a silent one meant dubitation and unanswered questions that would ever circle back to Nick, and when Matt eventually recaptured enough strength to assert his presence, the balance of power shifted again, because he surfaced not as a broken victim but as a man inspired by survival, applying his near-death experience as influence, intimating at secrets that could destroy families, pots, and patrimonies with a single disclosure. And Nick understood also that the peril was no longer physical but empirical, hanging to strike everything he believed in, forcing him to defy a horrifying verity that by nearly ending Matt's life, he'd bound himself to him in a way neither of them could escape, and as alliances shifted and backstabbing surfaced, Genoa City began to fracture along unnoticeable fault lines, Gemütlichkeit strained by dubitation, families divided by fidelity, and amid it all Nick stood at the center, a reticent symbol of how far indeed the most principled man could be pushed, and as pressure mounted, Nick faced choices that imaged the bone he'd formerly made, each demanding an immolation, each asking him to decide who he truly was when stripped of character and protection, and while some prompted him to fight back harder, to silence Matt permanently through legal maneuvering or strategic exposure, others advised that any further aggression would confirm the darkest rumors about him, leaving Nick insulated in his struggle, forced to navigate a path where every step carried unrecoverable consequences, and in the quiet moments, when the noise of Genoa City faded, Nick grappled with the consummation that tried murder wasn't just an act but a metamorphosis, one that reshaped how the world saw him and how he saw himself, and as the verity inched near to the face, hanging to erupt in a reproach that would review power in Genoa City, Nick Newman stood at a crossroads more dangerous than any he'd faced before, knowing that whatever came next would not only decide Matt's fate but determine whether he could ever reclaim the man he used to be, or whether that night had permanently altered the course of his life, setting him on a collision course with a future where redemption and ruin were separated by the thinnest possible line. As Genoa City braced itself for what everyone tasted was an ineluctable implosion, Nick Newman set up that the most dangerous battles were no longer unfolding in boardrooms or sanitarium corridors but inside his own mind, where the echo of that night replayed endlessly, reshaped by guilt, defense, and fear, because the verity Nick could no longer escape was that survival had changed Matt just as profoundly as it had changed him, turning the man into a calculated specter who now thrived on control rather than brute force, and with every scuttlebutt that blurted, every veiled trouble rumored through interposers, Nick felt the walls closing in as the megacity's nobility climbed to cover themselves from exposure, Alliances shifting with dizzying speed as people who formerly flattered themselves on fidelity suddenly recalculated their positions, and amid that chaos, Nick's relationship with his family fractured in subtle but ruinous ways, because while Victor concentrated on constraint and optics, viewing the extremity as another hostile trouble to neutralize, Nick saw commodity Victor refused to admit the moral cost of endless power games, and that ideological peak widened with every passing day, especially as substantiation surfaced that Matt had still distributed clones of his most dangerous lines, icing that indeed his death would spark a waterfall of exposures, a move that left Nick scuffling with the horrifying consummation that violence had no way been Matt's weakness, only his cover, and as law enforcement pressure boosted, Nick faced examinations that stripped him bare, forcing him to defy the story he told himself versus the reality others saw, a narrative where intent signified lower than outgrowth, and while no charges were incontinently filed, the absence of legal consequences offered no relief, because the court of public opinion proved far more ruthless, painting Nick as a man teetering on the edge of control, and as Gemütlichkeit cooled and business mates dithered, Nick felt a profound insulation settle over him, one that made him question whether redemption was indeed possible in a megacity erected on reproach and picky remission. And when Matt eventually re-emerged from the murk, not physically but strategically, orchestrating moves that exposed corruption in unanticipated corners of Genoa City, Nick realized the man's survival had burned a reckoning no bone could stop, because each secret unveiled carried contributory damage that gurgled outward, destroying innocent lives alongside shamefaced bones. And Nick was forced to defy the most ruinous verity of all, that by trying to cover his family through force, he'd unleashed a storm that hovered to destroy far further than it ever saved, and as the pressure mounted, Nick began to change in ways indeed he plodded to fate, getting more guarded, further strategic, espousing a restraint that framed on emotional pullout, because vulnerability had come a liability, and yet despite his sweats to part himself from the darkness, it followed him relentlessly, especially as Matt's influence continued to grow, turning him into a symbol of everything Nick despised yet stressed he was getting, and when a final disclosure suggested that Matt's reach extended into events long allowed resolved, tying back to once tragedies that had shaped Nick's life, the battle shifted from particular to empirical, forcing Nick to admit that this battle wasn't about one man's survival but about the kind of heritage he'd leave before, and as Genoa City prepared for another seismic reproach, one that hovered to permanently alter its power structure, Nick Newman stood at the center of the storm, formally more apprehensive that the coming move, whether toward verity, silence, or immolation, would define not just his future but the moral compass of a megacity that thrived on the vision that its sins could always be buried, ignorant that this time, the cost of survival might be advanced than anyone was prepared to pay. Staying locked into the same arc, the same relentless momentum, the same slow-burn psychological devastation that defines Genoa City when it decides to devour one of its own, the aftermath of Matt's expanding influence began to feel less like a scandal and more like a reckoning written into the city's bones, because every revelation he triggered peeled back another layer of hypocrisy that had been normalized for decades, and Nick Newman, once seen as the emotional counterweight to Victor's ruthless pragmatism, found himself recast as something far more unsettling, a man who understood exactly how fragile the line between justice and destruction truly was, and as subpoenas multiplied and sealed records mysteriously resurfaced, Nick became aware that Matt's true weapon was not information alone but timing, releasing just enough truth to destabilize without fully detonating, forcing powerful figures to panic and expose themselves through overcorrection, and in that climate of fear, Nick's isolation deepened, not because people openly turned against him but because they no longer trusted him to remain predictable, and unpredictability was the one trait Genoa City punished most severely, especially when it emerged from a Newman, and as Nick withdrew further, his silence was misinterpreted as calculation, his restraint mistaken for strategy, when in reality he was unraveling under the weight of a question he could not answer, whether the part of him capable of ending a life had always existed, merely waiting for the right justification to surface, and that question followed him relentlessly as the city's power structure began to crack, with old alliances dissolving and new ones forming in desperation, revealing just how many people had quietly benefited from Matt's operations, how many had traded morality for convenience, and how many now looked to Nick not as a savior but as a warning, and when it became clear that Matt had anticipated every attempt to neutralize him, embedding failsafes that guaranteed continued exposure regardless of his condition, Nick was forced to confront the truth Victor refused to acknowledge, that this was not a battle that could be won through dominance, because dominance was the very language Matt had mastered, and as father and son clashed over strategy, their conflict transcended this crisis, dragging decades of unresolved tension into the open, with Nick rejecting the legacy of intimidation he once feared becoming and Victor dismissing Nick's introspection as weakness, a divide that left Nick standing alone as the city braced for another shockwave. And that shockwave arrived not through a confession or an arrest but through the slow, devastating realization that Matt's survival had permanently altered the moral landscape of Genoa City, because now everyone knew the truth could surface at any moment, and that knowledge poisoned every interaction, every deal, every declaration of loyalty, turning survival into a daily calculation. And as Nick watched the fallout claim lives, reputations, and futures indiscriminately, he understood with crushing clarity that his attempt to stop one man had exposed a system that thrived on selective accountability, and that realization did something no accusation ever could. It stripped Nick of illusion, leaving him to face a future where redemption was no longer guaranteed by good intentions. And as the city whispered about what Nick Newman was capable of now, what he might do next, and whether he could ever return to the man he once was, Nick himself no longer searched for that answer, because he had finally accepted the most devastating truth of all, that Genoa City didn't destroy people by forcing them to become monsters, it destroyed them by showing them exactly how easy it was to justify becoming one, and once that door was opened, it never truly closed again. Keeping the same continued, laggardly burn young and the restless narrative energy, the same cerebral depth, the same sense that Genoa City itself is a living, judging presence. The fallout from Nick Newman's near-fatal decision continued to metastasize in ways no bone could completely contain, because formerly sweat replaced certainty. Indeed, the most important families began making miscalculations, and those miscalculations fed the veritably chaos they hoped to avoid, and Nick, now completely apprehensive that his name alone could no longer shield him from consequence, began to see the megacity else, not as a battlefield of rival intentions but as a fragile ecosystem held together by facades everyone agreed not to challenge until Matt had forced the issue, and as further sealed histories surfaced, it came clear that Matt hadn't simply exploited Genoa City's sins but had studied its psychology, understanding that exposure didn't need to be complete to be ruinous, only strategic enough to destabilize trust, and that consummation visited Nick most at night, when the megacity quieted and the weight of his conduct pressed down harder than any blameworthiness, because silence offered no distraction from the verity that his choice had accelerated a reckoning that couldn't be reversed, and while Victor maneuvered relentlessly to cover the Newman name from endless damage, Nick set up himself defying those sweats, not out of defiance but frustration, because the constant computation of optics had come unsupportable, and that resistance scarified everyone who depended on the Newman's pungency, especially as Nick began stepping down from places he formerly fought to save, motioning a shift that suggested not retreat but reckoning, and as Matt's influence continued to ripple outward through precisely timed leaks and circular pitfalls, it came decreasingly apparent that the man's topmost triumph wasn't survival but applicability, forcing the megacity to root around his actuality whether it wanted to or not, and Nick understood with bitter clarity that trying to exclude a trouble had only magnified it, transubstantiating Matt into an idea rather than a person, an ever-present memorial of how snappily control could slip down, and as connections strained under the pressure, Nick's distance from those closest to him strengthened, not because he watched less but because he stressed the damage his propinquity now caused, apprehensive that anyone aligned with him came contributory in a conflict that showed no mercy, and when whispers surfaced that others were considering taking drastic action to silence Matt permanently, Nick felt a bite unlike anything he'd endured before, because he honored that hunger for futurity, that attractive pledge of resolution through force, and it scarified him how familiar it felt, forcing him to defy the possibility that the megacity wasn't simply replying to his conduct but reflecting them, and in that reflection Nick saw the most disturbing verity yet, that violence, indeed when restrained, had a way of homogenizing itself, spreading through defense until it felt ineluctable. And as Genoa City edged closer to another unrecoverable moment, one where someone would nearly clearly cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, Nick Newman stood at the center of a storm he no longer believed he could overrun, apprehensive that the heritage he left before would not be defined by whether Matt lived or failed but by whether he allowed fear to mandate his future. And as the megacity awaited, holding its breath for the coming disclosure, the coming treason, the coming fall from grace, Nick made a quiet, ruinous consummation that would shape everything to come, that survival was no longer the thing, because survival without integrity was simply another form of loss, and whatever the cost, whatever judgment awaited him, he could no longer go to become the man Genoa City anticipated him to be. Indeed, if defying that anticipation meant standing alone when the final reckoning arrived.